Hey, my name is Dave Porteous, and welcome to part 3 of my HDR workflow tutorial. In this video, we'll be tone mapping the HDR we made in part 2 using the Details Enhancer method. If you would like to follow along, there will be a link in the description to the raw files that I used to make this series of tutorials, along with links to other videos in the series. To start with, we'll open the merged HDR file by going to File, Open, and locating the file. You may notice that this image looks a bit strange or washed out. This is just a preview, as monitors can't actually display the full color depth of an HDR file. In order to compress the dynamic range to something that will properly display on our monitors, we need to tone map the image. To do this, we go to Process, Tone Map. This is possibly my favorite step of the process, and a good amount of where the look of my photos comes from. There are several different methods for tone mapping, but my preferred method, and the one we'll be using today, is Details Enhancer. Before we start with the actual editing, if you haven't already, I recommend clicking Show More Options, as well as Show Advanced Options in the tone mapping pane. Also, go to View Preferences, and on the General tab, you want to make sure that Start Tone Mapping With is set to Settings of Previous Session. This saves a lot of time when tone mapping several shots in the same location, as you'll only need to make minor adjustments to your tone mapping settings between images. Moving back to the tone mapping window, I leave the strength at 70 pretty much permanently, and the color saturation I base on the image itself, usually somewhere between 30 and 60, depending on where it looks right to me. For this particular image, I think we should probably go with it right around 40, so I will leave it there. Tone compression, I almost always leave all the way up to 10. Moving it to the left will give you a much more natural look, but you lose a lot of details, especially in the shadows. Detail contrast I also leave all the way up generally. Having it further up will make the image look darker and sharper, and lowering it will make the image brighter and the lighting a little bit flatter. By default, you can have 5 presets for lighting adjustments, but for finer control, you can click the Lighting Effects checkbox, which will give you a slider. Lighting adjustments is sort of a difficult setting to properly explain, but generally speaking, having the slider to the left will flatten the dynamic range a bit more and even out the lighting, whereas having the lighting adjustment slider to the right will give you much more natural and pronounced lighting. This is something that I like to change on pretty much every image I edit. For this particular image, I think that a sort of flatter approach looks good, so I will leave the lighting adjustments set at -10. Moving on to the next group of options. I will come back to smooth highlights in a minute, but first I want to talk about white point, black point, and gamma. The white and black points are the point at which white and black clip. For example, if I were to turn the white point all the way up, it assumes that everything that was even a little bit bright in the original photo is supposed to be pure white. You want to keep in mind that if you set either white or black point too high, you're essentially losing image data that you might want to make use of in Photoshop. So I try to keep both fairly well, just clipping where you actually want the image to be white or black. Get that set about right. And then we will do the same with the black point. You can see if I turn it all the way up, it assumes that anything that's even somewhat shadowed is supposed to be pure black. So we will turn that down. I want to preserve as much detail as I can in the shadows. So we will just have that set just barely above 0. The gamma, as you probably know if you've used any other image editing program or even video games, often have a gamma setting. That is just overall brightness and contrast. I tend to edit my photos a little bit on the dark side, so I tend to keep the gamma pretty low. That's something that's up to your personal preference though. Moving on to the advanced options, micro smoothing reduces noise at the expense of also smoothing out detail. I tend to leave this at 0, unless I'm dealing with an exceptionally noisy image and I don't mind potentially losing some detail. Saturation, highlights, and shadows do exactly what they sound like. They affect how saturated the lightest and darkest parts of an image are. I don't actually get much use out of those. Sometimes shooting at night or in weird lighting situations, you can have shadows with weird tints or lights with weird tints, and it can be useful for that. But for this particular image, I think it's safe to leave them both set at 0. Shadow smoothness is roughly the same thing as smooth highlights, except for the shadows. It's not really anything we need to mess with in this image. For night photography that can be useful, but we will cover that in another video. Shadows clipping is very similar to black point, so I tend to just adjust the black point instead and leave the shadows clipping at 0. There is an option for panoramic images, but we are not shooting a panorama, so we will leave that unchecked. And below that we have the preset pane. You can save or load presets as you wish. If you want to save a tone mapping preset, you can do it here, and then reload it for another image if you want to reuse the same preset as a base. Once you are happy with your settings, click Apply, and then after a short pause, we should have our tone mapped file. To save it, we will go to File, Save As, and after making sure it's set to save as a 16-bit TIFF, save the file for Part 4, where we will be running the tone mapped photo through Photoshop CS6.